Welcome to SUP, the Super Urban Podcast, a discussion on cities coming from RMIT Architecture and Urban Design in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. I'm Ian Nazareth.
I'm Graham Crist.
And I'm Christine Phillips.
In the second episode of the Super Urban Podcast, we dissect another fundamental layer of urban development, cities as industry. If cities were once defined by ideological and religious order, industrial modernity reconfigured them into factories of progress and production, landscapes of extraction and acceleration. Industry was not merely an economic function, it was a defining urban idea and a remapping of power. Smoke billowing from factories was once a sign of economic vitality and civic virtue. With industry came stratification, pollution, and the entanglement between economic advancement and environmental degradation. What happens when the engines of prosperity become the mechanisms of decline and collapse? Have we arrived at the end of industry or merely its mutation? This episode traverses the industrial city's evolution, where railways were once the connective tissue of empires, birthing towns and economies in their wake, and later the automobile fractured urban coherence, ushering in sprawl, highways, and logistical spines that would redefine mobility and access. Now, in the era of digital economies and dematerialized labor, are cities still industrial, or have they become pure software, factories of data, energy, and capital? If industry no longer requires proximity, what holds the city together? If industrial cities were designed to process goods and people, what do they process now? Information, influence, exhaust? Have we substituted one form of extraction for another, replacing coal with data, production lines with algorithmic efficiencies? Is the city itself the industry, an infrastructure of endless optimization, a logistical playground, a warehouse of desires? Join us as we unravel these tensions between industry and environment, between expansion and exhaustion, between past aspirations and present crises. The Super Urban Podcast continues its excavation of the city, a machine, a system, an idea that refuses to settle.
So, Conrad, how would you say in the industrial foundations of cities like Melbourne or even regional centres like Geelong or other cities have influenced their contemporary urban layouts and economic structures?
Oh, very radically. The case in point is Footscray. Footscray once had a magnificent amphitheatre site that overlooked the Maribyrnong River, and basically the municipality gave up the whole thing and shifted towards the railway line when the railway line came through, and located its retail and its residential centre up there, and handed the bank of the river over to factories, abattoirs, boiling down works, the sugar refinery mills, the pork and bacon production area and so on. So they just relinquished their entire, what would be traditionally a beautified landscape fronting the river. That's one significant case in point. I suppose if you're thinking about other areas, clearly there was a concentration of industry around Yarra River initially, which was then sort of perpetuated in steam-driven factories that followed on from that, from water-driven factories, and that happened in Collingwood and Richmond particularly. And one significant element of that was the phenomenon of the walk-to-work city, which also occurs elsewhere in Australia, particularly in Sydney, where large factories developed in suburban areas. The people who worked in the factories had to be kept within walking distance of the factories, so therefore the housing density was much greater in order to contain residential dimensions. That also meant the streets were often very narrow as well. And so a lot of streets in Collingwood, North Melbourne, West Melbourne, Richmond were a little wider in a lot of cases than the nightman's alleys that ran behind them. They're often hard to distinguish the two.
It's interesting to talk about the walk to work city. There's a great study of some of the most dense bits of Paris and Barcelona where they were built in a period when the elevator had allowed vertical development of apartments, but the metro lines weren't yet in.
The metro lines weren't in, and the railways hadn't become oriented to commuting.
That's right.
Melbourne got into that fairly early.
From their apartment to the factory. Yeah.
Sydney was not. Sydney's commuter railways were not nearly as well developed as Melbourne's until probably the 1880s or the 1890s. And what that meant was that you got large areas without railways in the inner suburbs of Sydney, which remained compressed due to the walk-to-work phenomenon. There was only one something that approximated a commuter line, which was the line to Parramatta. And the other lines that filled that role didn't really come in till really about the 1890s, most of them, and the early 20th century. It was unusually late up there. There was probably more in Brisbane than there was in Sydney, come to think of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about also the location of the factories. You mentioned proximity to rivers.
Initially to rivers, the theory was that they clustered around the rivers because they could use water from the rivers for cooling or for flushing or purification or even for driving the machinery. So that when they became steam driven, they still perpetuated their original location around the rivers.
And of course there's the pre-settlement history of trading around rivers, like the Birrarung, the Yarra as well, which...
Well, they were trading and meeting centres.
It's
very interesting to see how, in fact, some of the biggest industrial undertakings actually subsumed First Nations meeting places, gathering areas, particularly the Jolimont Railway Yards, the Botanical Gardens, the Parliamentary Precinct and the executive axis of Spring Street, with the exhibition building at one end and the MCG at the other. So they actually neatly, all three of those actually sat on Wurundjeri, significant meeting areas for the Wurundjeri people.
Meeting areas and trading.
Out.
So it's almost as though, I think subsumed is a good word, because it's almost like a colonial stamping over of the former industrial, if you can call it, maybe not industrial, but trading areas, certainly.
With new components of transaction.
Exactly.
19th century Western transaction.
So, I mean, if we jump ahead a little bit, I mean, do you think there are any lessons that can be learnt from Fordist urbanism in designing contemporary industrial architecture and infrastructure? Or maybe we need to talk a bit more about Fordist urbanism.
Well, Fordist urbanism, from my perspective, means the phenomenon of self-contained urban forms that are directly related to factories. In other words, variants, I suppose, at different scales of company towns. Racine, Wisconsin for Johnson's Wax, Pullman, Illinois for manufacture of sleeping cars, presided over by William Pullman, and River Rouge near Detroit, which was another substitute city in which Henry Ford dictated all the urban forms, which were primarily factories which formed an approximation of a central city, and they had crowds moving around, and River Rouge was approximately the dimensions of a large central city like Detroit or like Boston or like Chicago. It was on that sort of scale, really, and arguably rather similar to Melbourne, actually, because it was rectangular and with a similar number of major streets. So in a sense, River Rouge, to take Henry Ford's utopia as an example, was an approximation of a 19th century central city. even if there weren't residential buildings or retail buildings. It was all manufacturing or industrial processing that filtered natural resources. So in other words, coal was shipped in, iron ore was shipped in, or iron roughly, and was then refined into steel. Other components were all formulated and processed on the site. That, of course, rendered River Rouge relatively impervious to strike action, except among the workers at River Rouge themselves, whose industrial activity was eventually put down spectacularly by a private army that Henry Ford brought to bear in the late 1930s, commanded by one Captain Douglas MacArthur.
I'm wondering if it's worth, in that context, talking a little bit about Sunshine, which a lot of people might understand as an outer suburb of Melbourne.
Similar. Yeah.
But is really a factory town.
It was a factory town, and Sunshine's generation is interesting because Sunshine grew out of Ballarat originally, that H.V. Mackay had developed its harvester, and it was being manufactured, or was about to be manufactured in Ballarat. But the corporation in Ballarat, the city administration in Ballarat, was concerned about wage levels, and so they submitted that Mackay had to conform to a series of wage standards for his workers. That prompted Mackay to move his whole apparatus out of Ballarat altogether down to what was then known as Braybrook Junction, which was a junction of the Bendigo and the Ballarat railway lines, and another line running down to Geelong. And then he named it after his harvester, which was Sunshine. So in a sense, he put his autograph on the whole development. And he created a self-sufficient town that was basically centred on the Sunshine Harvester factory. Its urbanistic resemblances were very similar to Pullman, Indiana. He was a kind of a benevolent, what would you describe it as, a benevolent despot over Sunshine itself. He had parks, he provided libraries, the streets were carefully coordinated in the direction of an architect called Robertson, who designed most of the houses, including, I think, Mackay's own house. But it designed a series of houses of different types. So in other words, it was all very benevolent, except when it came to the Sunshine Harvester workers wanting higher wages, at which point the benevolence stopped quite abruptly. And in that sense reproduced Pullman almost exactly, where once again the Pullman strike was put down quite ferociously in the United States. The outcome was very different in Australia, however, where you got the formation of industrial arbitration in Australia and the famous Sunshine Harvester judgment about with its underlying proposal that Australia have a minimum wage and that everyone would be graded, everyone's industrial participation would be graded according to that minimum wage.
I think what's also sort of interesting and perhaps resonates across, the examples in the United States, but also in Sunshine, is the kind of, I guess, the totalizing force that these industries have, or even a single industry has, and that they often relate to, I guess, social transformation or even labour laws, for instance. And I mean, there's a whole sort of discussion as well around how I think it happened with the with Ford in the United States, but also with Sunshine in Australia, about the 8-hour workday and other such proposals that were primarily driven through a question that started as urban form.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think the urban form in all of these settlements was quite comprehensive. So you sort of lived, breathed and thought Sunshine harvesters. If you were brought up in Sunshine, I have a friend who told me, you lived in Sunshine. The expectation was you'd go to the big technical secondary school there and you would then go into a job in industry, not necessarily Sunshine, but one of the other industries that began clustering around the original Sunshine settlement. So that there was a kind of a self-perpetuating character. There was a valve, a car engine or truck engine valve factory. There was Slazenger tennis balls, I think, and sports equipment. Monsanto established a very large chemical works in the vicinity. Then the wool warehouses also came and just began clustering. It became a magnet really just because it was identified with industry, I think.
And of course, over the years, we have seen places like Sunshine and also Geelong and all these places all over the world, that type of self-contained place that's revolving around industry has eventually declined. One might think of some other kinds of contemporary examples, but certainly places like Sunshine and Geelong. I mean, a lot of that's got to do with responding to broader and indeed global patterns and cycles. How can Australian cities design industrial zones that remain adaptable to geopolitical and economic shifts, do you think, Conrad? I mean, is that possible or...?
What, short of massive demolitions or...
well, maybe we can talk about some contemporary examples like the Docklands. So
yes.
We started talking about the city beautiful being turned into the city industrial, and probably in the in the late 20th century, early 21st century, we're more familiar with former industrial places being turned into more re-glamorised, I guess. Docklands, Darling Harbour in Sydney. Maybe Fisherman's Bend is the experiment that's about to really get underway.
Those large-scale orchestrated redevelopments, I think it's probably following a broad model of conspicuous rejuvenations overseas. There was a Docklands area in Baltimore, which was refurbished in the late 60s with participation of Mies and other architects. There was a Docklands in London, which was refurbished with signature buildings by Caesar Pelli and a series of other architects. In fact, even the title Docklands and South Bank in Melbourne both come from London counterparts of about 10 years earlier. So there is very much that idea of rejuvenation. The San Francisco Docklands area from the early 70s with Halperin and other landscapers being involved in the Girardelli chocolate works and areas at the base of Russian Hill in San Francisco was an early case in point, and Lawrence Halperin came to Australia and gave talks in the early to mid-1970s when San Francisco in particular had a kind of an alternative society, vaguely hippie aura about the whole rejuvenation, which itself was interesting because there was a de facto hippie almost regeneration in which people began occupying large, old, deserted factories with small businesses, refurbishment activities, small-scale automotive workshops and various other devices. And a lot of that occurred with the factories at Dandenong, particularly the GM factories, which were, about 10 or 15 years ago were reassessed for history overlays, for heritage overlays. And so you found them being inhabited by small businesses who would come in and occupy parts of large, old, spatially undifferentiated factory buildings and so on. So there was that unofficial rejuvenation, much more haphazard probably and unpredictable in its outcomes. And then there were the big coordinated projects, of which I think South Bank first, then Docklands, then Fisherman's Bend, or more recently Fisherman's Bend.
So I'm wondering, is there something in the DNA of those places that sort of determines their scale? I'm thinking about these, what you described, the informal rejuvenation is really different from the sort of really big scale blocks of the master plans of places like Docklands and so on.
Yes, because the informal rejuvenations almost have a kind of vaguely subversive, we're squatters, the sense of the squatter, even if they're not actually squatting. But the sense that it's a kind of subversive activity, a bit like guerrilla knitters, But certainly there was a grand level of redevelopment as well, and I think certainly South Bank in London and Docklands in London, which were world-renowned slum areas, were an inspiration for state governments in Australia looking for a way of stirring things up. The spectacle of activity was an interesting replacement for industrialisation. If you had declining industry, it didn't necessarily replace the industry that was in decline, but it gave the image of activity. One of the signature phrases I remember in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, was cranes on the skyline. That if you had cranes on the skyline, people would feel good. They would support the party in power because they'd feel we were really cruising
things
along,
are happening,
doing things well. And this was accompanying the ups and downs of the state bank folding in on itself and a series of economic upheavals. But cranes on the skyline, and it looked very impressive. And so there was a real investment in activity, the spectacle almost of activity. It mightn't necessarily have involved significant refurbishments or rebuilding of industry, but as long as the activity was there, activity goes a long way, probably into the realm of cities as theatre. An awful lot of New York, for example, is activity, is people running around, rushing around frantically. Whether it's necessarily more productive than Dayton, Ohio, I don't know. Per capita.
We'll get to cities as theatre in a future episode.
Yeah. But I think, the perceptions that these create are quite, compelling, but also critical to understanding the city. In relation to your point about the cranes, I remember there was a study that was been done, I think, in the early 2000s around where they were literally tracking the very large cranes that the only cranes that could actually build the super tall buildings, moving from Dubai to Shenzhen and those
that's right, moving internationally, kangaroo cranes, yes.
And that itself sort of suggests something about the economic ambition of a place. And and I was just thinking as a sort of extension of some of those ideas about, on one hand, certain industries that are growing but others that are declining. There is the questions that arises about the manufacturing in Australia, for instance, and the idea that while more classic sort of forms of manufacturing are declining, there's new industries that are replacing them. And I guess here I'm alluding to a whole new version of big box retail or e-commerce and just-in-time models, but largely they sort of sit within the form of a warehouse or a kind of footprint of a warehouse. And an Amazon, for instance, calls a lot of these sort of typologies fulfillment centers, and these seem to be these type of forms seem to be reshaping the peripheries of Australian cities, and it could be interesting to consider them either from are they planned, like the reshuffling of the grid or the rethinking of a more complex major project, or are they sort of more sort of surreptitious things that kind of are put into the landscape, which are not planned as part of a bigger system?
Well, one of the really startling sights was at a conference in Tasmania, flew back into Melbourne. It was a very clear day, so I could see everything that was going on in Melbourne suburbs, diagonally running across from the Dandenong region or the West Gippsland Dandenong region, the Cranbourne Dandenong region, upwards across Melbourne suburbs. And one thing that struck me was just how Melbourne now seemed to be surrounded by a wall of white roofs. As it read from above, Melbourne had this huge corona of white roofs, which presumably were pale colour bond roofs, either silver or white, topping warehouses. And the expanse of this was enormous, and I began to feel, what a huge part of Melbourne is now handed over to storage and transfer of already manufactured goods from somewhere else. and it was particularly startling in the Dandenong region, and again in the Huntingdale, Oakley, Westall region, beyond further in than that. And then there are other huge clusters around some of the northern suburbs. Around Preston, for example, was a case in point, and refurbishment of areas around the old railway yards areas and around the old munitions factories around Maribyrnong and elsewhere as well, where these white roofs were spreading over huge areas. And it seemed to me that it's possible to actually, from the air, to interpret Melbourne as a storage city, or perhaps with innumerable fulfilment centres. The northern ring of suburbs around Epping is another case in point, where I think if you follow the ring road around from Epping through to the airport, for example, you'll find once again this vast expanse of white roofs, no more than 1 or 2 stories. There's another huge area around Werribee and so on. And so, in a sense, storage and the transfer of goods has become an industry in itself. Rather than the old factories with conveyor or with belt-driven machinery and gantries from in the air and lines of people making things. The things are brought in. And I guess that's the other characteristic of the image of the industrial city. Where are things now being made? And I guess the explanation would probably be Thailand or somewhere, South Africa maybe, unlikely places. Nissan making a substantial portion of their cars in Britain on a need buy yesterday sort of, or need buy today basis, of which Brexit has played a singularly sort of thrown that whole system, I think, into chaos. But and of course, a current case in point is that a significant part of Tesla manufacturers in China, coming from a situation where both the proprietor of Tesla and his close political associates, of course, are officially anti-Chinese at the moment in terms of industrialisation and industry. So you're getting all sorts of anomalies like that, and a breakup of what had looked like a fairly stable globalisation.
Well, Conrad, hold that thought. We're going to have a short break and we'll come back and recommence the conversation in a second. We just played a piece by Sam Tout, West Australian musician, from his first album of last year, Just Floating Around. That was titled The Dreadful Shops. So, all right, we're back.
Yeah.
Conrad, maybe picking up the conversation, we've talked about 19th century factories belching smoke, and we've moved on to warehouses. What about if we think of the 21st century version of that, maybe the tech campus? We're shifting from manufacturing or storage to services. We might think of Silicon Valley or Shenzhen or the great headquarters of Apple and Google.
Yes, because I think they're all... Yeah, I think Cupertino in California is a case in point, and the surrounding areas of Silicon Valley connection, the partial absorption of older institutions that happen to be nearby, such as Stanford University, for example, would be quite interesting to explore there in terms of its proximity to Silicon Valley and Cupertino particularly. But also there is an interesting history of the technical centre. There were some developments in the Soviet Union, particularly in the eastern sections of the Soviet Union, which may well have flowed on from the shifting of Soviet industry east of the Urals in 1942-43, but also evolution of industrial precincts. A prominent one in architectural journals was Tsukuba Science City, which was, I think, it was near Tokyo, and it involved a lot of prominent architects, Arata Ozaki and others. And so it was an idea of a coordinated industrial environment. The predominant vocabulary in the architecture was postmodern classicism at that particular point. Got great coverage in architectural design and other journals around about the early to mid-1980s. And it was closely related to a parallel phenomenon, the multifunction polis, which was predominantly, I think it was Japanese development and resembled Japanese precinct development. So that as in Tokyo you had Ikebukuro and you had Shinjuku and you had Shibuya and Aoyama and other areas that had a reasonable level of specialisation but were overall retail and commercial districts. They also formed each one formed a physical identity in a great circle linked by the metro around central Tokyo and around Parkland and the Imperial Palace in central Tokyo. But to some extent, the multifunction polis was almost sort of developments of those.
So these multifunctional polises, I mean, if we think about those as a sort of new kind of Fortis production hub, are there any different sort of urban spatial conditions? Is it more that breakdown of?
Yeah. They had a certain level of homogeneity in their commitment to industry and technology and research, that you would have spatial and enough spatial facilities in a way to facilitate large-scale research. There was one proposed for Adelaide. It was going to go between the Salisbury axis, the Salisbury axis and Port Adelaide, I think, and it broke down because it was seen as almost a kind of, it was read as a sort of Japanese colonisation of Adelaide after a fashion. But interestingly enough, at a time when industry in the northern end of Adelaide was actually in the process of decline, car industry at Woodville and at Elizabeth, and again at Tonsley Park down south and so on. It came at a time when actually the car industry, for example, was declining in Adelaide at that point.
I think maybe where Christine was going as well on this question was that has the recent kind of tech urbanism, let's call it, contributed something different, say, than the 20th century Fortist?
I think it has in terms of making artefacts and making objects, or and particularly production lines.
Well, I'm thinking more spatially and architecturally. I mean, if we think about the old Fortis places with the big factory and the affiliated tech college and the housing, I mean, spatially, how do these new tech places, new industrial cities, what do they look like spatially compared
people
with
commute there by and large. It's interesting that in Docklands there's a very high vacancy rate for the residential buildings in the region, and I think there's an expectation people commute, and I think that's the same too for little micro tech areas. Monash, for example, got one along Blackburn Road in Clayton. It replaced, sections of it replaced the old drive-in cinema that had been previously on the site, and it took a long time for it to get going and to get sustained tenancies. So, but I think it was seen as both an adjunct to the university, an amplification, physical and a symbolic amplification of the university, and of a closer linkage to industrial areas that had existed around Monash University in earlier years, but where the actual linkage with the factory production north of Monash, for example, wasn't really all that clear and wasn't really seemingly all that developed. CSIRO was an early case in point where Monash actually developed a research area that sat between the university and the industrial area to its north. So it was a research precinct. And I guess probably the transformation of Docklands particularly, and presumably the areas that are replacing the old munitions factories south and east of Maribyrnong would probably be amplifications of that original configuration. But yes, it's a history that really comes to the fore in the 1980s and the 1990s.
I'm also, I guess, thinking about, proposals like, the National Innovation and Employment Clusters that then have, projects like the Melbourne Innovation District. And that's, the proposal for a series of new typologies of industry that might exist between and adjacent to universities, like extending from the CBD right up to Parkville, for instance. And perhaps their form and their spatialisation might be a sort of reaction or provide some resistance to the tech campus idea, because I think that they're looking at more distributed models where you nest a series of these functions and typologies within an existing sort of urban grid. And I'm wondering, how that could, I think, potentially offer sort of a more diverse model or more opportunities for to engage with the city.
It could do in terms of internal variety within, say, a Corona-like development around a university. In case of University of Melbourne, for example, there'd be a clear medical precinct that would be to the northwest of the Royal Parade Grattan Street intersection, and presumably an economic precinct of some sort south of Grattan Street. And there'd be similar developments at Monash University, for example, with Monash's large hospital down near Clayton, spawning and spreading a series of consultancies, laboratories and other areas, and an expanded parts of the university faculty around the edges of the hospital. So you actually get a kind of hospital city down there, which is about a kilometre northeast of Clayton Railway Station. So you're actually getting a miniature city that's dedicated primarily to medical purposes.
But I guess the difference is in the contemporary climate, it's more about those micro or intense sort of injections in an already built up area connecting to existing industries, whether it might be education or health or what it might be, and rather than containing it in the way that the Fordist place might have done, it's more about embedding on a sort of more micro manner. Would that be fair to say?
It's also, in an odd way, it's actually getting away from the strike-proof fortress idea. River Rouge was a strike-proof fortress.
Yes.
BHP House was a strike-proof fortress.
That's a better way of describing it. Yes,
before.
Exactly. Yeah.
These are much more integrated with the communities around them.
And all of this sits in contrast to what there's a sort of lurking dream with the tech world that the city might actually disappear and become completely virtualized. And once we get online, we don't really need cities in the traditional sense anymore.
No, I mean that's right. I mean, well, that's the myth, isn't it? The grand myth, and we've got as big data and AI automation and cryptocurrency and the virtualization of urban space reshapes economies and governance. I mean, how do you think these forces reformat the physical and the infrastructural substrate of the city? Have you got any thoughts on that, Conrad? Or will they? I mean...
Well, funnily enough, they seem a revival of something earlier, and that was Frank Lloyd Wright's Disappearing City and Broadacre City.
There you go.
That, in fact, you wouldn't have a city. You would have, you'd have a great entity spreading across the United States. The United States was taken as the matrix for the whole development. That would be open countryside partly, suburb partly, in varying levels of density, with elements of a central business district scattered across the country at intervals. And the action and the daily dynamic life of the city involved getting from one of these areas to another. So the renderings of Broadacre City emphasised people travelling around in vaguely flying saucer-like objects and cruising along freeways from this point to that point.
Yeah, it's a model that's really perfectly built for Uber and
it was built
Google
for,
and so on.
and it was built for working from home too.
Yeah, or from the farm.
Or from the farm. That you could, in fact, by implication now, you could run industries from the farm or from rural locations.
That great little tower that Wright designed in Norman, Oklahoma, I think it's for sale at the moment.
The Bartlesville Tower.
Bartlesville,
Yeah, well, that's extraordinary when you go and see it. It's a town of about 2,000 to 4,000 people.
Yeah.
So it's like a smallish country centre, and there's this 10-storey tower sitting in the middle of it. It's really quite bizarre because there are no other towers in Bartlesville. It's rolling country, sort of very benign, sort of with cabbage tree looking foliage round about and so on. And then there's this tower, which relates to the area being wealthy in oil and so on.
And Wright, of course, famously hated New York and called it a pig pile, I think, at one point.
Oh, right. Like
so there's this sort of great anti-urban impulse that sort of maybe aligns perfectly with the distributed world that's possible through getting online.
The curious thing to me, however, is why there's suddenly been such a strong reaction against the working from home and with all that implies about computerisation and of transmission of production through electronics over distances without having to be physically there.
Right. Well, now, I mean, bizarrely, we're now witnessing potentially a flip away from remote working and also remote manufacturing if we're going to put tariffs on everything
that's going to cut across it as well.
Right. So does that mean all those factories that have been declining are coming back? I mean,
and all the pilot plants that people have been building over the last 30 years or so, say in Malaysia or Thailand or Vietnam, South Asia, that they're now all going to be under challenge, or the huge American automotive production of Buick and General Motors, particularly in China, is now, and then Tesla, of course, in China. That's all now going to be directly challenged by a resurgent economic nationalism in the US.
There is something kind of cities have this great ability to be resistant to all those economic shifts. They're just kind of they're hardware that we just re-plug in or something. That even when we were talking about cities declining, well, there's kind of the manufacturing base declining. The cities stayed there,
but other elements
rebooted themselves into something else.
Other elements become resurgent. Tourism often injects itself into areas of decline. refurbishment of old dockside areas is often in conjunction with tourism. Melbourne's rediscovery of its alleyways has probably got something to do with that as well. And also probably stimulated by the vacation of large-scale office buildings during COVID, for example, and the break-up of the little service industries that all fed the large office towers, which was quite dramatic during the COVID period. And those areas are being replaced increasingly with tourist attractions, alleyways, arcades, graffiti in alleyways in the southeast quarter of the central city, elements like that.
I mean, it does sort of highlight, I guess, the idea of how many of these typologies and concepts are actually sort of recurring, and they come and they sort of have the different ways of manifesting themselves. And I guess in relation to not only describing the scale of some of those industrial buildings, but also the scale at which Wright was conceptualizing the Broadacre city. It does. I think something in between that would probably be, the megastructure, or thinking about buildings or objects that exist between something that's very large and not quite the city to some degree. But then you also have these ideas that are playing out in things like gigafactories and and hubs and smart cities, and they come back with different different variables in them. And one of the, I guess, most controversial ones at the moment is the NEOM, or the line, which is the proposition when it was first introduced was one about 100-kilometre long city, and it slowly kind of peeled away. And it does sort of capture kind of it does capture a lot of questions about urbanism, but also it's sort of a reminder, I guess, of the symptoms, the warnings, the cautionary tales, and at the same time maybe some solutions also built into it at the same time. And it did remind me a lot of when Charles Dickens sort of talks about Coketown in Hard Times, and that there is a kind of underlying kind of thing about a grim industrial city that is sort of shaped by exuberance or economic rationalism. And and again, it sort of intersects with ideas of labour and so on. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are on these new forms that continue to kind of reflect ideas that have been sort of precedent in cities for a long time.
Yeah, well, the revival of Coketown's interesting because a lot of Dickens's novel was really spelling out almost talking points or catchphrases of 1980s economic rationalism. Facts, facts, facts. Teach these children facts, etc. was said Mr. Gradgrind to Mr. McChokum, child and principal in charge of Coketown's education. And it seemed very much like the sort of substitute words that you got at the height of the economic rationalist era: workplace flexibility, tax reform. That there were a whole series of phrases that accompanied the positive, or played up the positive aspects of rationally organised economy, but yet in a city that celebrated work and or the work ethic and so on, which would be somehow embodied in architectural forms. I don't think that ever really crystallised overly. The nearest approximation of that, however, was probably in Melbourne's adaptation around about late 70s, early 1980s, when, not just Melbourne, but Australian cities overall adopted vocabularies of, say, John Portman's hotels in Atlanta, the School of Zahranen, Gunnar Birkitz and other architects, Roshan Dinkalo and those buildings, which were seen as embodiments of economic resurgence and were primarily associated with the Sun Belt of the United States. There was a whole movement to capture the imagery of economic buoyancy and recovery round about then. It was at the tail end of a long recession which had begun round about 1973-74 with the first fuel crisis and the Yom Kippur War. and had drifted on into the early 1980s with momentary signs of recovery that then seemed to go nowhere. And so Melbourne sort of suddenly became a city of mirror glass and of buildings that almost sort of reflected each other. And that phase lasted for several years as a highly mannered sort of, it was an extreme form of modernist purism, but it was also very much a symbolism or the embodiment of economic recovery as determined through the American architectural journals. And it was quite distinct from Europe, actually. And it's an interesting phenomenon to investigate as to where and how it developed, because it was very widespread. Now, in other words, you got the imagery, rather like the idea of cranes on the skyline, of activity somehow being a counterpart for industry, whether it was going to stimulate industry or whether it was a reflection of it, but it was comforting in a particular way. And likewise, if you adopted Portman imagery, of which I suppose Collins Place was probably the great example, it even had a bubble lift, didn't go 40 stories as it did in the US, but it went 4. And so it was trying, it was keen, and you just got that. It had an atrium, and because you had to have an atrium. A lot of buildings, were sold on the basis of atriums, a la Atlanta or Dallas or Fort Worth. It was probably underpinned by TV series that emphasised urban models, and that would be something interesting to explore, actually, was how particular urban models were the outcome of TV series.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Hawaiian Eye, Surfside 6, Dallas, Dynasty. There were a whole series of TV series over a number of years which actually had major architectural and urban consequences, I think, in how Australia configured itself.
So what does all this mean for cities today? The logic of industrialisation still shapes urban development, even as we shift from factories to digital economies. The same principles, connectivity, logistics and integration, now drive our discussions on smart cities, on automation and post-industrial urbanism. But are we truly post-industrial, or just shifting industries into new, less visible forms? We will extend this discussion into our next theme, cities as theatre. You're hearing us thanks to the generous support of the Alistair Swain Foundation and the RMIT University School of Architecture and Urban Design. We would like to acknowledge the people of the Bunwurrung and Woiwurrung language groups on whose unceded country we are recording this podcast, and extend that acknowledgement to all First Peoples of Australia who have been caring for the many layers of country for over 60,000 years.